going to get started. Thank you for everyone for coming. This is an exciting event. The event today is Storytelling and Narratives for Justice, and this is our wonderful round we've put together. I want to thank Lucy and Lily and Shalonda for setting up this wonderful event. This is a really great roundtable. I'm just going to go through and do a quick introduction of everyone. First, we have our Daynard Fellow, Chaumtoli Huq, is a professor at CUNY School of Law and the founder and editor of an innovative law media nonprofit focused on law and social justice called Law at the Margins. You can follow her on Twitter at law@margins. I don't know Twitter very well, so I almost said that. Law@margins. And if anyone else has a Twitter account that they'd like to publicize today, feel free. Professor Huq has devoted her professional career to public service, focusing on issues impacting workers from 2014 to 2015 with the American Institute for Bangladesh Studies. She has produced 2 short documentaries and a video on Bangladeshi women organizing in New York. So you can check those out, and I talked about those on Monday. Next, I'll introduce Cheryl Hamilton. Cheryl Hamilton is the director of Suitcase Stories, a program of the International Institute of New England that raises the profile of refugees and immigrant experiences through storytelling. If you've ever seen The Moth or listened to The Moth, it's a refugee and immigrant version of The Moth called Suitcase Stories. I've actually agreed to do one of these next year. She has devoted her career to advancing immigrant integration, refugee protection, and storytelling. Since 2015, Cheryl has also served as the director at Massmouth, a Boston-based nonprofit organization that promotes the timeless art of storytelling, where she curates the national television show Stories from the Stage. Cheryl also routinely appears in storytelling productions, including with The Moth, Risk, Soundbites, The Corner, and Massmouth. Next on the roundtable is Sarah Sharp. Sarah is a special guest of the International Institute of New England. Sarah is a senior at nearby Brandeis University. She majors in international relations and sociology with a minor in peace, conflict, and coexistence studies. Sarah was taking a course at Brandeis called Refugee Stories, Refugee Lives, where Cheryl was doing a guest lecture and workshop. They met, and Cheryl suggested that Sarah do a story, or they had to do a story as part of the course. The students voted Sarah's story the one that should be told on campus. The on-campus story went so well that Sarah actually told the story last Friday as part of Suitcase Stories in front of close to 1,000 people in Davis Square at the Somerville Theater. And I'm going to let you a little bit later not tell the whole story, but you can talk about what the story was like and the experience of doing that story. But it's just as a preview, it's about her mother and grandmother immigrating from Brazil, and her meeting her boyfriend's parents who asked about where she was from. Next on the panel is Vatsady Sivongxay. Vatsady said that her first name is pronounced like velocity. I always have to do mine, but I'll say that it's like Joe Namath. Weymouth, Massachusetts. Vatsady joined the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition, also called MIRA. That's an organization all the time. She's the statewide complete count coordinator. She joined MIRA this past summer in July to lead our statewide outreach for the 2020 U.S. Census, supporting MIRA's director in her role. Her background as an attorney, facilitator, public policy director, and entrepreneur, as well as her experience as a refugee immigrant, informs her strong commitment to democratic engagement and advancing equity, diversity, inclusion, and racial equity. Next on the panel is Cara Solomon. Cara is the founder and director of Everyday Boston. Everyday Boston teaches people interviewing and communication skills to elicit and share stories across cultural divides. a graduate from the University of Michigan and Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. Cara coaches the story ambassadors on interviewing, works with them to shape stories for the site, and teaches the organization workshops. Cara came up with the idea for Everyday Boston based on her conversations with people who live or grew up in the city and based on her own experiences working as a reporter for the Seattle Times and the Hartford Courant. On the panel is Armand Coleman. Armand is the restorative justice leader at Everyday Boston. He's also the volunteer development and community outreach coordinator for Community for Restorative Justice. Armand works on, especially with youth, but many individuals in focusing on treatment rather than incarceration and helping especially youths avoid having criminal records in their background, which might affect their ability in the future for employment, housing, and many other things. In fact, Lily Ibarra at Newsel Center for Public Interest Advocacy and Collaboration has been working with Everyday Boston on a project to interview and share stories of people who are involved in the juvenile justice system in their youth. At their suggestion, at Everyday Boston's suggestion, Newsel students will be paired with interviewers who are themselves formerly incarcerated to do the interviews. And there was a big training recently on interviewing in community restorative justice. So that's a project that Northeastern is working with Everyday Boston on, which is very exciting. I'm just going to jump in and let the panel talk, and I have some questions here. If we have time, we'll take some questions from the audience as well. Okay, so I'll start with Chaumtoli, but then everyone can jump in. This is sort of a general, big picture question. Hi. How and when did you decide to use narrative as a strategy for advocacy? You can sort of speak generally. I'll ask a little bit about specific examples, but how and when did you sort of decide that that's an important part of the organizations you've worked for or the work you do?
So again, I want to thank your really, I think it's like a gift. Shalonda had asked me, like, who do you want to, like, be on the panel? I just want to be in conversation with folks who are, like, on the ground doing amazing stuff around narratives, and I got my wish. And so I'm just in deep gratitude to be with each of you. So I'll start with that. So I come from storytelling and oral tradition. Multiple. So I'm from Bangladesh, and we have a very deep tradition of songs and a tradition called Bawal. For those who might know, I won't go into it, but if you're interested. I'm also Muslim, so that the way in which knowledge and values are communicated is through conversation and dialogue. And so, early history, when the Prophet would sit with his companions and be educated and learn about tales. That was my home life. But when I came to law, I realized that storytelling was very narrow. It was just fact and instrumentalist. It wasn't really about telling the human experiences. It was just about what do you put into your complaint and make it effective so you can win. And so, to be quite honest, like for much of my early career, I just was a very good technician of law. I used facts and stories in very extractive ways and very instrumentalist ways. I took stories from people, and I felt good about it because when I translated to the court, sometimes I won, sometimes I didn't win, and that's really what I thought about as storytelling or narratives. But I came at a point where I realized narratives actually determine the dominant themes and ideas and what's possible, what rights could emerge, what forms of justice can emerge. And so when I came to that realization much later, and hopefully now that you're here as students, you'll skip a few years in my kind of detour, I founded Law at the Margins with the intention of creating a space for people to talk about law and social justice in a much more expansive way. So just just very narrow of what we do, we cultivate stories around sort of impacted folks on law and politics. And we have started a new project called the Community Newsroom, which is to have individuals who are directly impacted by law to talk about policies, because oftentimes what we have is we have people telling their story as almost like exhibit A, and then we have the experts tell us, the analysts of that story. So what we want to do is say, no, the people who are impacted by law are the most, they are the best experts of social policy. And so that is the kind of premise. So I'll just end there, and I can talk more. I don't want to get into the weeds of like how that works and the mechanics, but I think that's really coming back to what I knew intuitively in my heart, is that storytelling is really a powerful. I knew that in my home culture. I just needed to kind of come to that, merge it into my legal practice.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to jump in on that one? Yeah.
Sure. I don't know if anybody here is from Lewiston, Maine, or Maine in general. That's where I grew up, and I guess you could say I came to storytelling out of frustration. About 20 years ago, 5,000 Somali immigrants moved into my hometown in the months after 9/11, and I was hired to manage the program. And without going on a whole detour that direction, I can just say that it drew national media, and lots of stories and movies and books were written about my town. And for about a decade, I read them, and I heard them, and I saw them shared, and some of them were thoughtful, but a lot of them were just very myopic and very not fair and not honest. There was a movie made about our town where every switch of a scene was a gunshot. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because there was no gunshots, anything between Somali residents and newcomers. It was this whole thing. And so finally I decided, you know what, I guess I could try to tell my story. It was changed by a friendship. And I took it to some publishers, and they're like, no one wants your story, they want the refugee story. And I said, sure, but the refugee story is also stories of those of us who became neighbors and colleagues and friends. Fast forward, I saw an ad in the paper. It said, do you have a story to tell? My friend's like, you do? So I signed up for a class called storytelling. I'm a poli-sci major, law. I'm class. Took the class, and at the end of it, you had to do 20 minutes of. And I was like, sure. So I stood up and talked for 20 minutes, which you can imagine is not hard for me to do as a storyteller. And the director said to me, you need to take that play and travel with it. And I laughed. I was like, I'm not a playwright. And he said, you don't have to be a playwright to share a story. Storytelling. So fast forward, I ended up writing a play. I traveled with it for 5 years, completely like entertaining myself about doing it. And then I put it away because I felt like I had said about how our town changed, how it changed everybody. And then the election happened in 2017, and I felt like if there's ever a time, it felt like deja vu for me about what happened and the anxiety about Somali refugees in my town, that I said to the CEO of our company, you know what, I think we should try this thing called suitcase stories. I've always wanted the other voices beyond, many voices are being talking about this, not just immigrants, not just US born, and certainly not just the people that are often used on the front pages of NGO annual reports, right? And the way those stories are told. So we started suitcase stories, and crazy enough, now it's my full-time job, which I also would have never expected 20 years ago.
Storytelling to me, I felt really moved, not only communities that weren't that didn't have exposures to immigrants, to minority Asians. I think certain Asians are, or all Asians are have equal opportunity. And being a refugee immigrant from Laos, I've had quite different experience. And I think that storytelling really brought it down to earth for so many people who may have seen an Asian person who did well in school and was, in sports and then went to law school, and they didn't realize how much our community has gone. And I think the heightened rhetoric into the climate, our stories as refugees, as immigrants and minorities have been able to connect all people of color and our historical struggles. And I think that it overall has built such a wider community. I find that even our white minority communities, now can relate to our refugee immigrant community as we're sharing stories. I mean, they're definitely different, right? We all come from different places throughout the world, but we have, at some point in time, our people have been oppressed. And sharing that has really fueled our communities together and also has pushed for legislation. And even in the State House from MIRA, it's critical that we bring our folks who can stand up for folks who cannot be in that room, to push legislatures, to get them to understand where we are at as a community and how they can be helpful, to see where we connect with them and their historical that we may have not ever have known unless we started sharing the story. Even through census, we, as the statewide complete count chair of the statewide complete count committee, our mission is to ensure that our most underserved or undercounted communities have the information, right? And how do we get legislators, elected officials, people in these huge administrative departments understand how can they connect to our people? And really, it's the narrative that we bring to the conversation that allows them to connect the dots. So I find storytelling super powerful. At the State House, one-on.
Well, I'll say for me, first time I ever told my story. I like to differentiate between storytelling and telling one story. The first time I ever told my story was actually in the Restorative Justice Program, and I was 40-something years old, and I kind of felt at that point I'd never ever been heard. So it was basically through Restorative Justice I got a control of my own narrative. I was able to go back to my own life, see what happened to me. We have a saying in Restorative Justice: hurt people, and heal people, heal people. And I like what you just said earlier about the people impacted by the law, the best people who speak to the law. I'm a living product of that. But one thing I realized, everybody that's even just speak to the people that are incarcerated. I did 28 years inside of prison for a crime I committed when I was 17. And for years, I was still governed by a lot of the traumas that happened to me as a youth. And there's a lot of guys that are on the inside who actually are taking the time to actually control their narrative, get an understanding of their narrative, see what happened to them, why it happened to them, and why they're acting the way they are today. And the only reason I'm out of prison today is because they recognize the emerging brain development of youth. Other than that, I'd probably still be in prison, so and there's a lot of people that's coming out behind me that are going through the same process of learning their own narratives. But there is one thing I will say about Massachusetts, Boston in general, is that there are a lot of people who are in positions of power who actually go into the prisons, hear people's narratives, go through restorative justice groups, and they're in positions of power, from the district attorney even to the governor Patrick when he was here, sheriff, and the commissioner of police. So I think it's about people telling their stories, not just about stories being told about you. And that's what made me actually just realize how powerful stories are. So once I felt heard, I felt that I wanted to speak. Prior to that, I came from a culture where we was told not to say anything, be quiet, stop snitching culture, be quiet. So you never actually said what happened to you, how it happened, what was the effect, how you felt. Once I got a mastery of learning all those things, I was able to actually have a control of my narratives and have courage to actually say this.
I just want to, first of all, say thank you. Thanks so much. It's just very moving and impressive to hear all of your stories. I would say that my relationship to storytelling, it's taken a lot of twists and turns. I think it has definitely had a healing power for me. When I was a kid, seems like a kid now, when I was 19, I was diagnosed with cancer, and the narrative that is around that experience is very, very narrow and full of stereotypes that actually set me up to fail in a lot of ways in relationships and in the way that I saw myself for many. One of the only ways that I could sort of come back and be a part of the world again, frankly, was to reach out for other people's stories. And so that's why I was, because I was really interested in actually hearing other people's stories. And then I started becoming obsessed with how people's stories were represented in media, and how, in particular, I think there are a lot of, the stories are very narrow and again, sort of one-dimensional in certain ways. And so I sort of tried to take on little mission of, in my own newsrooms of trying to complicate some of the narratives that were out there. And eventually, I came back to Boston and realized in the course of freelancing that, these stereotypes obviously were circulating all over the place. And that it wasn't enough for me to sort of parachute into neighborhoods and write human interest stories about people that I thought were underrepresented or clearly were underrepresented in response to concerns that people had raised to me. It seems much more important to actually teach people how they could reach out for each other's stories, similar to a reporter. And so that's how Every Boston began, which was essentially a story collecting project. And it was created in partnership with 4 community leaders from different neighborhoods, one of whom had recently come home from. And so it's a very different, I'm doing a different kind of, my relationship to stories is very, very different than it was in the newsroom, and I'm happy.
One thing that comes to mind, especially as a student, one thing that I learned by getting involved with storytelling is that all of these experiences based on your positionality in society, your socioeconomic background, ethnicity, but then you come from all those experiences, you come from this background, you learn so much. But then when you're in a position of prestige or when you're in an interview or an academic setting, it's as if all of that doesn't matter anymore, as if you kind of devalue it in a way where you kind of hide it and you don't use it as a valuable experience or something that you put on your resume or explain in an interview. And I think, connecting with that part of you adds so much more to your character. And I think just understanding the value and the power and potential behind telling your story can add a lot more after in any given position. So that's the way.
Thank you. I talk loud. I don't need them. I talk too loud. So that was really helpful to think about how you got into this part of your work with narrative and storytelling. I'm wondering if you can give some examples of where a narrative or a story that you've told has been particularly impactful to people and maybe convinced people that you didn't think could be convinced. Anybody can think that.
Please. I'll just share a project that we just completed. It's called The Right to a Home. So, Law and the Margins sort of model of narrative is what we call collaborative journalism. And so myself and collaborator, co-editor, Eric Ortiz, who's formally trained as a journalist, I guess wannabe. And the idea is that, kind of to Armand, those who set and control the narrative really determine the policy and how the issues are looked at. And in law, for those who are law students know, in contracts, you want to be the drafter. And so, oftentimes, we look at the back end of the story, once it's created as a product, but we don't look at the process of how that story gets to emerge. And so if you really want to empower voices, you have to actually, I love what you're doing in terms of story collecting. So we put a formally trained journalist with a community reporter, someone who's directly impacted, and for them to then identify a particular issue. In our Right to Home, what we did is we collaborated with 4 street newspapers. For those of you who are not familiar, they're papers that basically have historically served the unhoused community, and they have editors and they have an infrastructure. So what Eric and I did is collaborate with them to identify unhoused reporters, to identify, what should be done about homelessness, right? Because New York Times has this whole spread on homelessness, and they can't even get any homeless or unhoused folks to actually be interviewed. Yet there are so many reporters out there. Then comment on the different issues. We have 4 papers in Nashville, Oakland, and DC, and Chicago with this particular model. And we had a separate, which was just the unhoused reporter doing their own story. Veterans around criminalization of homelessness. And so this right to home, which is kind of a policy demand, is that ultimately we need homes for girls. That has to be a human right and a right. But the way that we get to that advocacy is by people who are direct. So I'm not trying to, go away from my day job as a law lawyer, but I want to show that you can actually change the narrative, produce, this advocacy if you put the sort of little pen in the hands of the folks, pen or other medium, the folks who are most impacted. And we want this model to be replicated in other institutions, collaborative journalism model. So for me, that's kind of an example that we're really proud of. It's gotten an enormous amount of success, where the national editor of the Times is like, why didn't you think about that? It's like, you wouldn't think about that. Because if you don't center people of color, you don't center those who are most impacted, you don't think they have actually anything to contribute. So we need to shift who tells the story. And that for me is really important of what we're trying to do. But we're just little stuff. Who wants to go? Sorry.
You guys have something you want to answer?
That's rolling,
I've lost control.
I just wanted to say, I think, going over the narrative, I think we're going through it in the modern day today. I'm a child of the 90s. I was born in the 70s. I entered prison in the 90s, and I entered prison at the age of 17. I worked with the narrative in 1990 around youthful offenders with that. They were super predators. They were taking over. They're going to take over one man, crime spree on the horizon. And that was something that got me swept up as well as thousands of other people. Some guys been there way longer than I have been in there. But if you just look at how it goes today, people are actually, look what Brian Stevenson is doing as far as telling the narrative of what youthful offenders are going through, fighting over the Supreme Court, using personal stories and narratives actually that effect. I'm telling you, I'm out right now because of his work. I consider myself his work product. If he didn't go to the Supreme Court and argue that fact, I wouldn't be out here today. It's like hundreds of people in Massachusetts that are coming out. Well, and even I did 6 years in a prison called Norfolk, prison, quote unquote, and I've met everybody in there from the district attorney to the governor of Massachusetts to people from the Obama administration. And there's a youthful offender coalition in there. Everybody in there convicted under the age of 17, and people go in there and hear their stories. And I like to think that those stories actually have some type of impact, and they take it back and they actually file policies on it. It's like I said, it's a lot of contingents of politicians that go in there and they sit down in restorative circles with these guys and they hear them out. And even like James Eldridge, all of them, and they actually shape law according to, I think, what they hear, or it kind of contributes to how they advocate on that behalf. So I think just telling a person's story, build some type of connectivity, especially when you're in those spaces and everybody's required to share something from their past. You see that we have some level of connectivity, or we got more in common than we have that's not in common. So I like to think that when you sit in those intimate settings and you actually speak the story with people, no matter what level of society they're in, they're going to come out with a level of connection that they can't forget, or they can't overlook, or they can't ignore.
The narrative for the immigrant and refugee experiences are coming out more and more. I honestly think it's because there's always been a fear, and you're an immigrant yourself and that you live in mixed households. It's really because we've been taught to just be quiet. We've been told, coming here to the United States, that things up. As in our experience, that's how we survive, right? And that's how we got. But our experience prior to leaving our country, or prior to having to flee a certain situation, is most of us were totally different. Prior to the wars, prior to the conflict, some of us or our parents were teachers, were doctors, were nurses, the people who were community members in our faith organizations, and making huge impacts in our native country, right? And we came over to the United States to really be seen. And a lot of times that's the reason why people didn't share. But nowadays, because we really need our leaders and our other community members and neighbors to really understand that we are valuable and we can make a difference and we can move things together, that narrative has been coming out. So we've been seeing a lot of folks who were prior doctors in their country, young children who have experience wanting to speak up so that other folks can really understand their journey, why they're here, and why they want an opportunity, not just for themselves and their families, but the futures of their friends and their community. Right? So for MIRA, we are really connected to people on the ground, and we find support and a safe place for them to share the story and to help them bring their narrative up to the State House or DACA students to the congressional level, and we provide that support for them. And I think that has been really impactful, and it has really, again, going back to our community, allow our community. Because it's not just about moving other people who may not know us, but to move our community and then allow them to come to be themselves again.
Yeah, I'm just going to say directly relate to the idea of being silent is very complicated. Actually, what my story was about when I presented last Friday, how I spoke of how I was invited to New York to meet my at-the-time boyfriend's parents for the first time at the Shabbat dinner, which was my first experience. And as they're asking me, as a father specifically, who's a little bit more conservative, he's asking me, my major, what I plan to do, and I'm got this, and I'm trying to get an impression, and liking me. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he asked me, no, did they come here legally? And that was the first time that I feel that my background is ever questioned. My legal status is not even my own, but my mother's, which I felt protected by myself as a woman who raised me and gave and done so much. But instead of sharing with him, how far my family has come, I was so caught up, as I say in my story, making this impression that I kind of didn't need it, and I kind of silenced myself. And at the time, I said, I don't know the story. I've never asked about how they got here. I just know that they're legal, and and that just puts myself in a lower position because I came to where I am despite how they came here, and they got to where they are now despite how they came here. So I think a mission that we have as storytellers and as people who can see what storytelling or the power that storytelling has is to normalize it because it's very important.
She closed the show, and we were like, okay, Sarah's done. We're all done. It was amazing. I guess a couple things I'll add is that these stories we have U.S. and foreign-born people. We also go into companies with it as a way to talk about diversity and inclusion. We take it into schools for kids to feel heard and honored. A couple points I'll make. One, I'd like to think we've had some impacts. One is just the narrative around immigrants versus non-immigrants, right? That narrative itself is flawed. It assumes that all immigrants have this deep, meaningful connection with each other across different. It assumes that all non-immigrants have this same experience. And I'll never forget being backstage with a woman who's from Syria who was about to go on stage and tell her story for the first time. She'd been in the country 18 months. She didn't speak English when she came, and now she's going to stand in front of 400 people and with some breaks, but very clear English, tell her story. And she starts panicking. Not just to stand in front of 400 people, right? She has this extra obstacle. And before her is a woman from the Dominican Republic, who's telling a story about how when she came to the United States, she knew English, but because of her accent, she wasn't getting hired anywhere. They just had all these preconceived notions of her. And the woman from Syria taps my shoulder. She goes, she didn't know English? I said, well, she learned English, and then she had an accent. She's like, okay, if she can do this, I can do this. And she went out there and told this beautiful story, and the two of them went backstage, and neither of them, the woman had never met Syria, and the woman from Syria, this is her first time meeting someone. And that itself builds alliance. But on the same subject of alliances, another thing we've framed Suitcase around is much like the LGBTQ marriage equality campaign. We know the LGBTQ community took the risk. They led that campaign. It's because of them we have marriage equality more than anybody else. But it really did take people who are not gay or lesbians to stand up and say, these are my relatives, these are my friends, these are my colleagues. And the same thing goes for immigration. All of us are affected by migration, whether you move from a small city of Boston, you have similar feelings of fear and change, and not to the same degree that many refugees and immigrants have gone through, but at least it's something to start from, to talk about. And the last thing I'll just say is we cannot underestimate exposure, power of exposure. I often say that someone performing like Sarah on stage, like that can fundamentally change the trajectory of opportunities for her. We've had people get job offers, we've had people being asked to give keynotes, we've had people asked about doing television shows afterwards, just because for 10 minutes someone gave them a platform. So the biggest privilege I have is just helping people do that. So if that's something in your life that you can do, that would make a great difference.
In the immigration work we do, I find a lot of narrative and storytelling is focused around the deserving versus the undeserving, and often you can achieve the results that you want in an individual situation by focusing on the deserving nature of your client or whoever you're representing. And I'm just wondering if that comes up in the work you do and how you fight against that, because that narrative might be helpful for the individual person you're focusing on at the moment, but maybe not to the broader community.
That's a narrative that has been blasted across all sorts of media and traditional, and that immigrants or illegal immigrants, which I don't like to use, but undocumented, don't deserve anything. That's really what the narrative is. And we heard that yesterday. Student being addressed. That was terrible. It was pretty traumatic. Terrible traumatic. But we don't use underserving for whether somebody is deserving. Because at MIRA, we believe that our society can give and more. Right? When we use that, it triggers negative reaction and a negative narrative. We don't know where the other person is coming from as far as their political and social perspective. So we like to use a more empowering narrative. And that's really using, who is this person, right, that we're presenting? And how are they valuable to our community? And what will it take for us to work together in order for us to strengthen our communities for the next 50 years? Right? That's a narrative we want to talk about. We're talking about valuing each other and valuing our community, and not letting somebody say, well, your community is not our community. Really, there's no such thing as 10 communities, right? It has been a political decision and a political narrative that has created these communities. And I don't really love to hear his voice echo. But I've been really good at a lot of people. I've been more strategic. But I'll pass on.
Does he want
So one of the things that just strikes me, the way that newsrooms do sort of promote very neat stories that make everyone feel good and perhaps are not reflective of reality. And one story that comes to mind is a story that I wrote many years ago about a woman named Tamila Cormier, and a report had come out about the tremendous odds that people and young people in foster care face when they age out. And so I did this profile on Tamila, and the idea was that I would spend really a few months on and off following her around, and that her graduation from high school would be the Sunday front page story. Because unlike the rest of her family, she was really She had advocated for herself significantly. She was going to be the first in her family to graduate. And so everyone, frankly, all the white men at the top of the masthead in the newsroom were very excited about this story as young African American. And at a certain point, the story was kind of almost ready to go. And then maybe like 3 weeks before she was set to graduate, she just actually died. And she just didn't want to go to school. And that was it. Like she just kind of like lost it at the last minute. And, and to me, this made perfect sense, even though I had a completely different life and a set of life experiences. But I sort of inherently sort of understood the idea that you don't necessarily move forward in a straight line. However, there were a lot of discussions and debates and a lot of dispiriting discussions and debates around whether that story even was going to get published, because her story did not fit the idea of almost what deserves to be on the front page. That is not a happy story. That is messy. Why did she do that? Like, I don't understand it. These are kinds of all the questions. And it took a lot of fighting, in particular, the fight from a woman at the top of the masthead, a woman, very powerful editor, and we pushed it through. We pushed it through in the end, partly because she did graduate. She just graduated later in the summer, but she didn't graduate the way she wanted to. And it wasn't on. I think it was on the front page, but it was not a Sunday story. It was just an interesting and very frustrating, very demoralizing experience to see how good, hearted people, well-meaning, smart, people can also really fall prey to this idea that narratives have to have a beginning, middle, and end, and they have to go a certain way.
As it concerns restorative justice, as deserving, undeserving, label that has no place. Everybody's story matters, and everybody deserving of having their story told. Case in point is that when restorative justice is a survivor-centered or victim-centered practice. However, in order for you to become a benefactor of restorative justice as an offender, one of the first things that make you recognize that you were also a victim yourself. You can start with the premise that you would not have gotten into criminality, you would not have committed a crime, you would not hurt people again. The concept of hurt people, and heal people is a mantra we often say in restorative justice. So that's that everybody has a story to tell, and once they dig deep, you don't even realize that you being held captive to your story because I speak from personal experience. I didn't know my own story. I probably buried it or whatever, but once I got it out of me, it kind of like changed me. So, and I want to keep harping on it because I think it's millions of people locked up in prison here, and just like anyone who returned immigrants, they're disenfranchised as well. They can't vote, they don't have the same rights, even if they've gone through a transformation and they've been healed and they've given back and whatever, still they're not fully restored to citizenship. Even when they return to some states, they're not fully restored citizenship. So I don't think nobody's beyond redemption. They go through the process they have to go.
The only thing I just wanted to share, is for me in different contexts is taking payment. I think it's just I'll just bring in terms of like Muslim organizing. There's been this tendency to say that I'm the good Muslim, I'm not the terrorist. And so I also resist the use of the word terrorism or terrorism. I think it invokes this kind of division. Same thing about criminality, because once we begin to categorize, we're moving away from our human rights center that every individual being, even if that being doesn't have a reason. I mean, I would maybe push a little bit, even if the person has done harm and there's no necessarily cause. There are individuals who are experiencing mental disability who, due to different reasons, cause harm, and there may not necessarily there could be causes for it, meaning they're not a victim necessarily, they still are human beings, and I think that we have to figure out, either as lawyers or narrators, how to be creative, and so you just have to work harder in doing that. So any story or narrative that creates that division, I just actively resist that. America is a land of immigrants. I think that is erasure of indigenous people. It's an erasure of forced labor, slavery. Like all of these narratives that we take for granted is actually on the backs of someone else's humanity. So I think we just have to sit with what are we saying and think about the person who has done the most wrong to you in your life, in whatever way that might look. Are you able to sit and hold space with that person? And I've had encounters in my life where I've had to do that. I've been forced to do that. I think I shared an example in my talk about assisting a woman who killed her child. And so as a mother, I had to sit with that young woman. And so, and that for me, I think was just challenging. And it really put to my talk to my act. And so that's what I think we're called to do, is to really challenge ourselves to really, do you really believe all the stuff you're saying about? It's when you're at that moment and you're holding space, and then be honest with yourself.
I was just going to add one thing about the practitioner application of this. So I work with employment counselors who work with refugees and immigrants all over the country, and their job is to go find employers to hire refugees. And as you can imagine, there's some perceived obstacles right there. I mean, people are new to this country, they don't have the same resume, they may not have the paperwork to prove their backgrounds. But well-intended advocates will call employers and be like, oh, this woman just came from Syria, she really needs help, she was in a camp for many years, it's very difficult for her. And all of those things can evoke emotion. But that's not the way the employer is listening. The employer is looking for a talented employee who's going to work hard, dedicate their time, have skills, and you've both done a disservice to the company in assuming that they're deserving just by the nature of the person's narrative, but you've more importantly done a disservice to the individual who has skills and talents from that experience itself. The transformable skills of having to go through that experiences applies to management and crisis management and application and creativity. There's skills to highlight, but more, you set that person up in a position of seeming as if they were being aided, not invested in. And so for me, that's really important for us to think. I really like what you said about holding space. We fumble with our words, right? And we have to be accountable for those fumbles and work.
There's storytelling involves, I think, some deeply personal aspects of people's lives. In the normal day-to-day life, we have small talk. So, what do you think about the weather? Medium talk. What do you do for fun? And then I don't know what the one above that is, big talk or large talk, but I saw Armand do this before we got here. It was Armand, Chaumtoli, and I, and within one question of them introducing each other, he said, "Tell me about your first love." This happened, yeah. The answer. It's a great story. So I'm going to start with you. But what are some techniques that you use to get out people's stories? I was so impressed with that. I left the room because I didn't want to. But I did, yeah.
I'm going to cheat and copy. My first question was people, what brings you joy? Before I start with our clients, because people are often most struggling with our reason was hard in their lives. I just start with what brings you joy.
Well, I guess we can go down the line. Yeah.
I think I have a big fascination with culture and where you come from, so I always resort to what's your nationality or where's your background? Or what is your background? Where do you come from?
So I
Hello. Mic check.
I like to share a little bit. And I also present to a huge audience.
Hello.
And I don't know, I don't know who they are. So I always talk about, here I am, I'm an immigrant, and I'm actually from Kansas. So people don't think about that, right? And then people don't think like, oh, well, she's also an attorney, because I am presenting as of folks who are immigrants, who are migrant farmers, and I'm talking to them about very sensitive issues with other people in the room, the district attorney, right? And so how do I bring everyone together? So I like to share about just a little bit about myself, and that kind of helps bring context. And then there's the space for people to decide whether or not they want to share publicly with how what they're thinking, or if they'd like to talk to me afterwards. Right? So that's how I do it.
Hello, my microphone.
You made me realize that I didn't introduce myself at the beginning of this. Anyway. My size blocked. Anonymous moderator.
So like a question. One question I'd like to ask is, what would you be surprised? What would someone be surprised to know about you? And so I sort of have people go, I really like it. And the other I like is, what's exciting for you today, like at this moment. And sometimes that brings people into like a little bit of crisis because they're like, nothing's exciting for me. And so, or sometimes they're like, oh, I'm really excited about this, and it just brings attention to that moment, that like millisecond of a moment.
Let's say, restorative justice is all about, like somebody was, when I first started restorative justice, they asked you, like, what's one thing that every survivor wants to know? That's why. Like the why, what happened. So usually when, like myself, when I went through a restorative justice program on the inside, the whole question was geared toward, why did I do what I did? So at the end of that process, I could sit in presence of survivor, the mother of a homicide victim, and actually tell them in detail, not just what happened, but why it happened, and what happened to me. But that has to be done like in a safe place. It has to be done in a place that people feel like they can actually share their stories. They're not going to be judged. And it usually works. So, as it concerns like everyday Boston, what I asked her about, I learned everything from Cara. She trained me, so I let her speak to that. I think I said that before, Anthony, didn't I?
Well, one of the things that we do with every, the idea really is that we've all got life in common. So we've all had a first crush, we've all gone on an adventure, we've all left home for the first time. Even if you live with your family, you leave home when the first time you go to school or you go to work or whatever it might be. So I love those questions. I love the first crush one is my favorite. Armand has puffed it. First love. Really, I would not have answered that. First crush one. But I try and get to those kinds of questions. What the connection? That's where connection. To me, it doesn't like.
It's a good question.
But any kind of tell me about a time when things that we focus on with everyday life, perhaps people that not. I like to believe are kind of the gateway drug to human connection. So, that's what I try to go after those.
And I'm Hemanth Gundavaram. I'm on the faculty. We're still waiting. Actually, in the clinic, one of the questions I almost clients who come in is I always ask about food, just because that's my passion. So I'll ask about what's a favorite dish that you grew up eating, or what's a favorite dish, which inevitably leads to the food in Boston sucks from the client. Like I can't find X food here. Another sort of question, I think it's in line with the fact that we have a diverse group here, but we have a lot of students here. That's always my focus on the students, and wondering, these are sort of young storytellers. They're going to go out in the world and be lawyers. Do you have any advice for them as they go out? Not that you haven't been out in the world. It's a tough one, I know. Yeah.
So to be the best attorney that you can be, it's really important that you listen to people's stories. How are you going to gather evidence for your client and be the attorney they need you to be? Okay, listen to their story because it's going to reveal a lot of other, possibly stories about the other side. And then you can go from there. I think then you can, definitely. You'll find out what they like to eat. Yeah. You'll find out, maybe that's an important evidence in the story. Maybe they were eating something while somebody was alleging that they were actually in the parking lot, right? So listen to that story and see where it goes, and then determine how you can or cannot or should not bring that into advocating for them.
So I will, one of my most favorite thinkers is Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a Vietnamese Buddhist. And I actually just played a clip of his interview in my law class. And so I thought that my advice would be what he has said. Is he talks about compassionate listening and to allow the person that you're listening to do. It's more than active listening. Active listening is just personality, getting the information. So compassionate listening is, basically allow the individual to share and what he called emptying the heart, and to again back to holding space for that. And it's not the moment to criticize or to ask more questions and to say anything. And the other kind of quote that he's often attributed to say is basically the greatest gift you can give someone is your presence. And I will say that over the course of my career, in cases I've lost, cases I've won, it's amazing that the number one thing that clients or people or anyone have said is something that you've remotely done well, is to say, I feel seen, I feel heard from you, but non-judgmental, not trying to fix me, not trying to give me a solution, and just really being present. And I will tell you, it is hard to do, to sit physically, to hear someone's life story. It's you really need to kind of build a practice for that. So I'm a huge proponent of Thich Nhat Hanh. And I think, for those who know, he's a Vietnamese Buddhist. He's been someone who's been attributed to influencing Martin Luther King on taking his Vietnam War speech. And so I just think that's a huge, that would be my favorite advice. This is I played it recently in class.
I guess just a few things that I would say. Cultivate curiosity wherever you can about people from all walks of life. I think we often tend to, particularly in the nonprofit world or when you're advocacy world, perhaps be drawn towards a certain group of people who've been perhaps the underdog, and be more curious about that group of people than you are about other people who have had more privileges, but you won't understand how to shift the world, really, if you don't have curiosity about everybody. So I think that's a big thing. I think humility is a huge, I think that, it's huge. And I would say that something will never, people forget what you said, people forget what you did, but they'll never forget. So, I think that's critical. Yeah, and go into it. I also would say it's really important. I only say this because I used to work with law students. I was at Harvard Law School for a while. And I think it's just really important to see every approach, and to the extent that you can.
Massachusetts passed the laws and respect to youthful offenders. The thing they did was they built in to the law that everybody that's incarcerated as a youthful offender has the right to have an attorney. So Massachusetts actually affords you funds to have an attorney. And the reason I mention that is because I had a lot of attorneys in my life. I was even blessed to have like Geraldine Hines, who became Justice Hines, as my attorney when I was convicted. But she worked on the but I got another attorney at the end of my sentence by the name of Angel. And she really worked with me. She really took my approach of knowing that I was about restorative justice. She actually molded that into my presentation. And it was an unconventional presentation before the parole board. Like going to parole board, like going to trial. It's crazy, the hoops that make you jump through. And I actually was able to get parole with her direction. But the thing I want to mention is that she went beyond the scope of what a normal attorney would do. Even today, she's with me, helping support me, and it's all like we built a relationship. So I would just say if you get involved in law, I mean, I was getting involved in law, and it's going to be like a large contingent of youthful offenders coming out of prison or needing attorneys to get out of prison. Especially if they raise the age to like 21 that they plan on doing. And they're going to need attorneys who actually go beyond the pale of what a normal attorney would do, get them out. So I would just say, like, just listen to them, be compassionate, don't actually take it, don't always take the road that they was wrong, or just hear them out and just actually work with them, and it could actually happen, and you could change somebody's life. Like I said, my attorney, I wouldn't even probably be in Massachusetts right now. I wouldn't be in the halfway house I'm in right now were it not for her, and a lot of other things. So it's very, like, I think the attorney-client relationship could be a very intimate one, especially if somebody like sharing, like, I'm gonna just be honest with you, like, to get out of prison, you have to share more with your lawyer than you had to do when you went into prison. Usually most people, when they go into prison, like me, I was trying to say the minimum that I had to say. I wasn't even admitting that I did the crime. I mean, that's why Geraldine Hines had a hard fight getting me, like, I wouldn't even speak. I was under the cold silence. I didn't want to snitch, all that. But to get out, you actually have to open up and tell the whole story the way it is. And you don't have the right attorney to actually guide you through that process. It can be difficult.
I want to open it up to questions. I have one last question, and it's going to be a quick one. So I'm just going to ask you not to expound other than to answer the question, which is, do you have a book or two that you recommend that you've read that has been particularly helpful for you in terms of your storytelling and narrative or your social justice lens? I know it's just a book or two. I always want to give you homework. So.
You want that?
Yeah, you can just say it. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to run comment on the career thing, just to add what it's cliche, but write your stories now that you're living now and in your career, because the arc of a good story is one that has, and if you're doing like theMargins, and you're going to want that material later. I look back at my career and I laugh and embarrassed by some of the ridiculous things I was thinking I did when I was in my. And that makes my storytelling now and the meaning of what I do and how I do it different. So think about that. The book I have is literally in my car at all times. It's called Becoming American. It's a 400-year anthology of people who are immigrants writing about their immigrant experience. Some heartbreaking, some hilarious. Like there's the scene 200 years ago of an Italian immigrant daughter yelling at her parents because they're not using forks. They're using their hands. Fast forward 200 years now, Somali family fighting over forks. Like, it's just a good reminder to me all the time that this is what we are as a nation. We are constantly becoming as individuals and as a country.
One of my favorite books is by Jeffrey Sachs. It's called New Foreign Policy. And it talks about how great America is and in this great country. It's at a point where it thinks it can remain number one by being the only one. Realizing how others are moving ahead and it's being in geopolitics and everything else because they're working with other countries. It sort of highlights all of that. And it's really eye-opening.
I think some folks here may have already read the story. I really like the hate you give. So I read a diversity, equity, and inclusion, and anti-racism book every single month, even though I was a 4-year-old. But yeah, we do have reading time. You guys have to your parents or have some time for that. But I like it because it's really accessible to everyone. I mean, I have to force myself to write at a 3rd grade level every single day, because what I'm writing every single day is instructions, right? And I need to make sure that our migrant family, migrant farmer family can actually take my instructions and make an impact in their community. And so that's what I see in the hate you give. I think that a young person can read it. I think, an immigrant person learning English can read it, and anyone can really relate to or learn from it.
So one recent book is Black Workers Remember. It's by Michael Hunt Smith. And,
Can you say that again?
Black Workers Remember, and it's a series of oral histories because my area is labor and employment, and I'm sort of committed to really this. You don't have to elaborate, but just organization of Black bodies and Black labor in the United States. I think that's really powerful. The second is something I've been before, but it's Left of Marx, Life of Claudia Jones. She basically is my hero. She's who I want to be. She's a Ghanaian immigrant who's deported to the UK, and because of her activism, and she's a Black woman who wrote about, she's a free Black communist. And I just think she's just phenomenal. She started Carnival in England, and so she's all about jamming and politics, which is what I'm all about.
I think this is so I can't. I mean, one of my most they're called The Sun Does Shine, which is more by Anthony Rahinton, who was on death row for 2 years, I think, wrongly convicted. Brian Stevenson got him off. The reason I read it was because I interviewed him for an article, and he blew me away. So what I would say, to be totally honest, is that the way that I learned, that's the way that I challenge myself. That's everything that most of the things that I've learned about.
I would say 2 books. First one I would say is a book called Blood Brothers. It's a narrative of stories of Black men who were in Vietnam. And the reason I chose that because it helped me understand my father's addition and his story. The next one I would say is Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. I read that in prison. The book actually made me cry. So, and like Cara said, he got me out. I mean, his book actually got me out. So, but that book was very, very, very touching to me.
Well, thank you, everyone. I'm going to open this up for questions if people have questions. We don't have a lot of time. Yes.
First of all, thank you so much. Fresh air.
Ouch.
Sensational. And when you were talking, we'll be in a room who has others where we're with them. And I wonder if any of you think about that, how we tell
trauma, or people tell trauma without fetishizing or sensationalizing that?
I think my advice is think about your own experience and walk yourself through telling that story first. That's going to really help you relate when you need to seek out and make them feel safe. I went through, it actually helped me open up to myself. And because as a person who have gone through trauma since I was 2 years old, because I had been displaced from 2 years old until I was 5. My mother was displaced from 4 years old until she was 11. So there's at least 2 generations of traumatic experience. And I think that when I was going through this training, they asked me to share a story. And it was really hurtful because it was the first time I shared it. But now I see that so valuable because when I'm sitting here, listening to a person, I'm trying to understand how I can understand them. That experience really still stays with me, so that I can help them through their traumatic experience, and make sure that whatever they're willing to share, that I'm not there to share their story. I'm just there to amplify. It's very vague, but it's really about knowing yourself and getting yourself to feel what they're going to feel.
So I'm going to focus specifically on helping someone craft their story. There's a larger conversation about trauma. When I'm working with somebody who I know is interested in telling stories, sometimes they come to me and they've been told by someone else, oh, you should go do a suitcase story, you should do a suitcase. I know that most people think when they recommend someone, they want the most epic story. They're looking for the traumatic thing that they want to, or word, which you just shared it. Most times, we actually don't end up choosing that story for a couple of reasons. One, the person's not ready to tell it. 2, they just don't want to ever tell it. Or 3, I often say, that's actually not necessarily the story we need to hear in society right now. There's a place, if you'd like to share that, I'm not going to tell you you can't. But part of the problem is every Syrian story right now is the bomb in the community. And we've had that story too. But also, like, what is the Syrian doing in Turkey for those 4 years? How does that look like when they're there? Or what does it look like when they get here? We just had a woman who was Syrian. And how she actually has been embraced by, like, her neighbors. And she's like, then her children are not. And the tension that creates in their home. Like, these are the stories that more of us can connect to. Because if you've not lived in a refugee camp or you've not been a refugee, sometimes that is actually a little harder to build a bridge. The other thing is to be thoughtful. I've told people I can't have, because I know they're not ready. And it's smarter for me not to put that person through it. It's smarter for the audience not to sit through it. And it's much more important to know what's the bigger goal. But I like to see nonprofits take more of a unique approach to picking out the narratives that they're sharing in the work that they do. Not always going to this is the most vulnerable, you must help them. In fact, they're like you is a better narrative.
Actually, I have to say, when I first volunteered in the classroom to speak, to share the story, it was very just casual. I was really just doing it to get a solid participation rate in class. And then Cheryl comes in and she's like, wait a second, why don't you add? And at the time I wrote the story, I had ended that relationship. Telling me to, but why don't you think about this moment, that moment? It's like, well, I wanted to go back to that, and so I think it was only until how it made me feel that I didn't really think about beforehand. So by sitting down, I think it really matters about how to define trauma, because I didn't realize how much it impacted it again.
And give people permission to walk away. We've had people from Vietnam do a piece about being Vietnamese refugee, totally excited to do it. And then they're 3/4 way through, like, actually, I can't. I'm like, great. So we have backup people ready to report.
So what comes to my mind is that I think it's very easy So Brian Stevenson, again, Brian, has this saying where he says, you know, we're all more than the crime that they really profound. What I'm saying is we're all more or something. Right. And so I think that to me, that's the thing we're really thinking. Entirely get the complexity of their humanity. And oftentimes people don't want to be dwelling. One thing that comes to my mind is that we do workshops inside prison, and at the end of the workshop, people share their stories. They interview each other about their life experiences, and originally people were coming up with their own prompts, and they were oftentimes related to, like, tell me about the first time you got arrested, or tell me about, it was all sort of trauma related. So returning citizen that I work with said, actually, why don't you switch up? Why don't you give them the prompts and make them a little bit lighter? And then we went over, we came up with some. And so I went in the next time, and it worked really, really, because the guys were sort of clamming up when they were interviewed. And then I gave them, you know, tell me about your first crush, tell me about your hidden talent, tell me about your, and like, looked around the room, and everybody was just sort of coming alive and laughing, and guys that had not, you know, not talked before really, or from the unit were communicating, because they were remembering what it was like to have a best friend, best childhood friend, and they were reliving that part of their lives, because that, of course, is part of who they are, as well as their experience.
Well, thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but this was a really fantastic conversation.